They were worshipped as holy men, guardians of the gods, keepers of divine secrets. But behind the stone walls of ancient Egypt's grand temples, another story was whispered. A story the priests buried with rituals and with bodies. What if the empire's sacred protectors hid the darkest truth of all? If this story grabbed your attention, hit like, share it with others, and tell us where you're watching from. We want to hear your voice. For centuries, the world has regarded ancient Egypt as a realm touched by the divine, a land where gods walked beside kings, where temples rose like mountains, and where every wall carved in stone seemed to promise eternal purity. Yet behind this immaculate facade existed a political and religious system far more human, far more fragile, and far more conflicted than its monuments suggest. Egyptian temples were not merely places of worship. They functioned as economic centers, political headquarters, and cultural nerve stations controlled by powerful priesthoods. Their authority expanded and contracted through the centuries, sometimes rivaling the influence of pharaohs themselves. In public inscriptions, the priesthood presented itself as the guardian of cosmic order, the custodians of mapped purity and sacred discipline. But within these same institutions, power struggles, rivalries, and internal hierarchies shaped daily life in ways that were anything but divine. Among the temple personnel were women dedicated to ritual service. They were not temple virgins in the literal sense familiar from later Greco-Roman traditions, but they were expected to maintain a state of ritual purity. Titles such as Himatnecha, priestess, Shemayat, chantress, and, in Thebes, the influential office of the god's wife of Ammon, required strict observance of purity codes. These women performed music, upheld ceremonial routines, and participated in rites that connected the human realm with the gods. Their purity was symbolic, a requirement tied to religious function, not a formal vow of lifelong chastity. Yet the idealized image surrounding them contributed to a perception of untouchable sanctity. This contrast between public sanctity and the complex political reality of temple life reveals how ancient Egyptian religious institutions crafted an illusion of divine perfection while operating as human systems shaped by ambition, control, and ritual authority. As Egypt's centralized state expanded, the priesthood evolved from ritual caretakers into one of the most influential institutions in the ancient world. Their power grew gradually, rooted in their exclusive command over religious knowledge, ceremonial traditions, and the daily maintenance of the gods' earthly homes. In a civilization where the divine legitimized all authority, those who interpreted divine will naturally accumulated influence. By the Old Kingdom, major temples controlled land, labor, and agricultural production. Endowments granted by pharaohs to honor the gods often became permanent economic estates managed by priests. Over time, this flow of wealth created a parallel power structure. The priesthood began to function as a vast administrative network. Tax collectors of temple lands, managers of workshops, and overseers of large labor forces. Their political weight increased not through rebellion, but through the steady accumulation of institutional privilege. By the Middle Kingdom, high priests were regional power brokers whose approval could strengthen or weaken royal initiatives. The most striking example emerged in the New Kingdom, particularly in Thebes, where the priesthood of Ammon commanded immense resources. The high priests of Ammon controlled lands, rivaling the royal treasury, and managed networks of scribes, craftsmen, and officials. Their influence reached such heights that, during the 21st dynasty, the high priests effectively governed Upper Egypt, while pharaohs ruled from the Delta, a division of authority unprecedented in earlier centuries. Spiritually, priests held an unassailable position. They were the intermediaries between humans and gods, trained in sacred texts, ritual calendars, and purification rites known only to temple specialists. Their literacy and ritual expertise set them apart from the general population, reinforcing their status as an elite class. Wrapped in sanctity, shielded by their divine role, and protected by a reputation of ritual perfection, they operated largely beyond public scrutiny. To the outside world, the priesthood appeared untouchable, the keepers of cosmic order, whose actions were presumed righteous by definition. Yet this rising authority, rooted in economic power and religious exclusivity, created a system in which their decisions shaped Egypt's political future as much as those of the pharaohs themselves. Women who served in Egyptian temples did not enter these institutions by chance. Their selection followed cultural expectations shaped by status, lineage, and religious tradition. Families viewed temple service as an honor, and girls chosen for roles such as Shamayit, Chantress, Himatnecha, priestess, or attendants in ritual performances typically came from respected households, often from local elites, priestly lineages, or families connected to temple administration. Their appointment reinforced social alliances and strengthened the family's public prestige. In most periods, girls were not taken by force. Instead, they were offered or presented for service through formal appointments recorded on stelae or temple inscriptions. Families believed that dedicating a daughter to divine service brought spiritual merit and enhanced the household's standing. Purity in this context referred to ritual cleanliness, the ability to perform rites without defilement, rather than a strict doctrine of lifelong chastity. However, the symbolism surrounding their role created an image of exceptional moral and spiritual discipline. Training for these girls began early. They learned ritual music, sacred recitations, and specific functions tied to the cult of the deity they served. Their environment was structured and heavily supervised, reinforcing the belief that those who entered temple service were living embodiments of order and devotion. Families often regarded this path as a guarantee of protection and stability, assuming that the authority of the priesthood would ensure the girl's safety and respect. Yet the system carried inherent vulnerabilities. The priesthood's authority was absolute within temple walls, and external oversight was minimal. The hierarchy placed male priests in positions of control over resources, schedules, rituals, and personnel, including female temple staff. The imbalance of power meant that those serving beneath the priesthood depended entirely on institutional discipline and internal checks, mechanisms that varied across regions and dynasties. While public inscriptions portrayed temple life as an ideal realm of purity and structured devotion, the concentration of authority in the hands of a small elite created openings for abuses of power. These weaknesses were rarely documented directly, but the structure itself, with its rigid hierarchy and opaque internal control, reveals how vulnerable individuals within the system could become when divine reputation shielded institutional authority from scrutiny. Daily life inside Egyptian temple complexes followed a rigid and meticulously organized structure. These institutions operated with a rhythm dictated by ritual calendars, purification demands, and the precise timing of offerings to the gods. At dawn, the inner sanctuaries were opened only to priests who had undergone strict purification, washing with sacred water, shaving body hair, and wearing linen untouched by impurities. Female personnel such as chantresses and priestesses participated in musical performances, ritual recitations, and festivals that required their presence. But access to the innermost rooms remained tightly restricted. Silence and order shaped the atmosphere. Movement within the complex was regulated by hierarchy, with each role confined to designated areas. The architecture itself reinforced control. High walls, secluded courtyards, and corridors leading to restricted chambers created a sense of separation from the outside world. Every action was monitored by senior officials responsible for discipline and ritual accuracy. These layers of supervision were justified as necessary to maintain the cosmic balance, but they also concentrated authority in the hands of a few. The rules were extensive. Ritual purity dictated everything from diet to physical contact. Personnel were expected to maintain emotional restraint, avoid impropriety, and follow established procedures without deviation. These expectations created an environment in which obedience was not only encouraged but essential to the functioning of the temple. Over time, such control could impose psychological pressure, especially on younger or newly initiated members adapting to the complex's closed structure. Historical records, including instructions, tomb inscriptions, and administrative documents, reveal that temples maintained areas that only specific ranks could enter. These restrictions were part of normal religious protocol, but to those unfamiliar with the system, the division between accessible and forbidden spaces could create uncertainty. The lack of transparency reinforced the authority of senior priests, whose knowledge of restricted areas and specialized rituals was rarely shared beyond their own ranks. While no ancient Egyptian texts openly describe abuses occurring within these boundaries, the combination of isolation, hierarchy, and absolute religious authority highlights how vulnerable individuals could feel within such a controlled setting. The unease documented in later commentaries about priestly power reflects the broader societal awareness that life behind temple walls operated according to rules understood only by those who enforced them. Within the structure of Egyptian temple life, divine rituals were designed to maintain order, uphold purity, and affirm the bond between the gods and the community. Yet these rituals, built on secrecy and complex hierarchies, created a system in which religious authority could be misused. The priesthood controlled access to sacred knowledge, dictated the meaning of symbolic acts, and defined the boundaries of purity and impurity. In the hands of corrupt individuals, these very tools could become mechanisms of coercion. Rituals that required strict obedience gave priests significant leverage over subordinates. Purification rites, lecture recitations, and ceremonial performances were all presented as essential duties, and failure to comply implied spiritual deficiency. Historical wisdom texts and administrative records show how temple superiors used moral authority to demand unquestioned discipline. When a religious act was framed as the will of the gods, resisting it became nearly impossible for those trained to believe that their role depended on submission to sacred order. Psychological pressure arose from the belief that purity was the foundation of divine favor. Ritual mistakes were feared, not simply as procedural errors, but as potential offenses against the gods. High-ranking priests could exploit this fear to maintain absolute control. Girls serving in musical or ceremonial roles were particularly dependent on priestly approval, as their positions, livelihoods, and reputations came entirely from the institution. Coercion often took the form of obligations, masked as sacred responsibilities, tasks assigned under the banner of holy duty, extended hours of preparation, isolated instruction sessions, or private purification briefings, placed young initiates under direct supervision of powerful figures. These activities were legitimate parts of temple function, yet their structure allowed superiors to operate without external accountability. The imbalance between authority and vulnerability created conditions in which personal boundaries could be blurred or overridden, all while framed as ritual necessity. Later, critiques of Egyptian priesthood, especially from Greek and Roman observers, described instances where religious prestige enabled misconduct. While these accounts reflect outside perspectives, they highlight a broader recognition that a system built on secrecy and unverifiable claims of divine mandate could be manipulated by those within it. The transformation of sacred authority into a tool for personal dominance did not require dramatic acts. It emerged from the subtle misuse of ritual language, the exploitation of spiritual fear, and the ability of a closed hierarchy to silence dissent. In such an environment, the line between holy duty and unholy coercion could disappear entirely, invisible to the outside world, yet deeply felt by those who lived under the weight of priestly power. The lives of lower-ranking temple workers rarely appear in the grand inscriptions carved onto stone walls. Egyptian history, like many ancient records, was written by those with authority: kings, high priests, and elite officials. Their narratives celebrated ritual perfection, divine order, and institutional glory. Yet scattered across minor papyri, personal letters, and fragments of administrative texts lie brief indications that life inside sacred institutions was far more complex than the polished public image suggests. Some of these documents come from workmen's villages, legal archives, or discarded temple records. They describe disputes over mistreatment, reprimands issued to subordinates, and complaints about abuses of power within religious estates. While not explicit accounts of suffering by female temple staff, they reveal an atmosphere in which superiors could act with little oversight and in which low-ranking individuals struggled to challenge authority. In one fragment from Deir el-Medina, a worker accused a local official of exploiting his position. In another, a woman petitioned the authorities after being wronged by someone of higher status. These glimpses show the underlying dynamics: hierarchy, vulnerability, and fear of retaliation. Temple servants, especially women assigned to ritual tasks, rarely left behind direct testimony. Their roles were prestigious yet tightly controlled. Their daily isolation within sacred compounds, their dependence on priests for instruction and evaluation, and their limited contact with the outside world created a social environment where grievances could not be openly expressed. Silence, whether chosen or imposed, became part of their lived reality. Emotional truths can often be found not in what was written, but in what was omitted. The absence of personal accounts from female temple personnel reflects how their experiences were filtered through institutional voices. When individuals operated under a system that equated obedience with spiritual worth, suffering was easily hidden behind the language of devotion. Fear took the form of internalized pressure, the dread of ritual failure, the consequences of displeasing superiors, and the isolation of living within walls that symbolized holiness yet confined their agency. Modern historians acknowledge these gaps with caution. The silent spaces in the record do not allow us to reconstruct specific stories, but they reveal the contours of a system where those most vulnerable had the fewest means to speak. Their silence, preserved across millennia, stands as its own kind of testimony, an echo of lives lived under the weight of authority. In a world where sacred duty could overshadow personal suffering, and where escape was not a choice but an impossibility shaped by the very institution meant to protect them, the priesthood of ancient Egypt maintained its authority not only through wealth and ritual expertise but through a carefully constructed system of secrecy and discipline. Sacred knowledge, including the proper execution of rites, access to inner sanctuaries, and understanding of calendrical ceremonies, was restricted to those initiated and trusted. Breaches of protocol were met with strict consequences, ranging from reassignment to menial tasks, to social marginalization within the temple community. Historical administrative texts reveal these punishments were systematic, designed to preserve the integrity of temple operations and enforce obedience without question. Secrecy was reinforced by both physical and psychological measures. Restricted areas, locked storerooms, and hidden chambers ensured that only senior priests could enter spaces essential to ritual authority. Initiates learned early that disclosing details of ceremonies or misusing sacred objects could lead to social and professional exile. The combination of isolation and surveillance created an environment in which compliance was essential for survival, and curiosity became dangerous. Cultural and religious beliefs amplified these controls. The authority of the priesthood derived from its role as intermediary between the divine and the human. Questioning or exposing temple practices was equated with challenging the gods themselves. Divine authority, reinforced by the weight of social custom, imposed a system of moral and spiritual guilt on those under supervision. Temple texts, ritual hymns, and funerary inscriptions frequently invoked curses for those who transgressed sacred norms, serving as both warning and deterrent. Social mechanisms also reinforced silence. Public shame, familial expectations, and fear of divine retribution prevented lower-ranking temple workers from challenging authority. Even those who observed irregularities or abuses were constrained by the belief that the temple operated under cosmic order. Historical evidence shows that the combination of hierarchy, religious legitimacy, and communal enforcement allowed a few powerful figures to exercise extraordinary control with minimal oversight. In this system, power thrived because it was rarely questioned. The temple became a self-protecting machinery. Wealth, secrecy, and religious authority converged to enforce obedience, conceal misconduct, and maintain the illusion that every action, however extreme, was sanctioned by the gods themselves. The result was a controlled environment in which those with authority could act unchallenged, and those without it were bound by fear, ritual, and silence. Even within the tightly controlled environment of Egyptian temples, the system of absolute authority was not entirely unchallenged. Historical records, inscriptions, and later commentaries occasionally hint at moments when the carefully maintained silence faltered. Deir el-Medina, the village of workers who built and maintained royal tombs, provides one of the clearest windows into dissent within the sacred and bureaucratic spheres. Legal complaints and petitions from workers revealed that disputes over labor, punishment, and unfair treatment could reach higher authorities, evidence that even within a religiously justified hierarchy, accountability had narrow channels. There are traces suggesting that families sometimes resisted temple assignments for their daughters. Papyrus contracts detailing the dedication of children to temple service occasionally include petitions for leniency, or records of disputes between families and priests over ages, obligations, or debts. These documents reveal a tension between religious authority and social expectations, showing that not all families accepted temple decisions passively. On rare occasions, inscriptions and historical accounts suggest that initiates themselves resisted. While direct testimony from girls is scarce, marginal notes and later historians describe instances of escape attempts or desertion. These attempts were rarely successful, as temple compounds were heavily controlled, but their very occurrence indicates that the system's coercion was neither absolute nor universally accepted. Even high-ranking officials sometimes expressed concern over abuses or excesses. Greek and Roman observers, writing centuries later, frequently commented on the wealth, power, and occasional corruption of temple institutions, noting that strict control could be exploited. These accounts, while distant in time, reflect knowledge of structural vulnerabilities, cracks in the empire of silence where power, though formidable, was not infallible. In these small acts of resistance and questioning, the human dimension of temple life becomes visible. Fear, authority, and ritual order shaped behavior, but the persistent desire for autonomy and justice occasionally punctured the facade of divinely sanctioned control, leaving traces that historians can still detect across millennia. The authority of Egypt's priesthood was never entirely static. Over centuries, shifts in political power, foreign invasions, and internal reforms gradually eroded their dominance. By the late New Kingdom, pharaonic power began to fluctuate, leaving temples increasingly vulnerable to political pressures and fiscal instability. The once unquestioned control over wealth, land, and labor was challenged by both administrative reforms and the rising influence of new ruling dynasties. Foreign incursions played a decisive role. The Libyan and Nubian invasions, followed by the Assyrian and Persian occupations, disrupted the continuity of temple administration. Priests who had relied on centralized pharaonic authority found themselves negotiating with outsiders or displaced by competing power structures. Documents from this period showed diminished landholdings, reduced resources, and redefined responsibilities for temple estates, weakening the institutional autonomy that had previously shielded internal abuses. Ideological shifts also contributed. As new kings and reformist officials sought to consolidate power, they curtailed the independent authority of high priests. Policies introduced during the reigns of Ramesses III and later monarchs restructured temple hierarchies, sometimes reserving key religious offices exclusively for royal women. These reforms limited the reach of the priesthood, while simultaneously codifying oversight mechanisms that curtailed arbitrary actions. The combined effect of political, military, and ideological pressures was the gradual exposure of long-hidden practices. Ritual abuses, previously protected by secrecy and divine legitimacy, lost their institutional cover. Administrative records, once inaccessible or classified, became vulnerable to scrutiny. The collapse of the old order did not erase centuries of misconduct, but it removed the systemic protections that had allowed it to continue largely unchallenged. By the end of this period, the balance of power had shifted. The priesthood no longer held unassailable authority, and the temple system, once a fortress of both sacred duty and private control, began to reveal the human costs that had been obscured for generations. Historical memory, long filtered through the voices of the powerful, began to catch glimpses of those silenced, finally allowing fragments of their experiences to enter the record. History rarely preserves the voices of those without power. In the case of Egypt's temple virgins, what survives is a fragmented record, inscriptions praising divine service, administrative logs of obligations, and occasional personal letters hidden from public view. These traces remind us that official narratives often mask uncomfortable truths, presenting a civilization's monuments and rituals as evidence of order, piety, and achievement, while concealing the human cost that enabled them. Across millennia, scholars and institutions have interpreted these silences in varying ways. Some dismissed minor papyri as insignificant. Others misclassified letters as forgeries, and many accounts of abuse remained buried in archives, inaccessible for generations. The systematic erasure of inconvenient evidence demonstrates a recurring pattern. Societies protect their image, often at the expense of the vulnerable. The suffering of those bound to religious hierarchies was hidden, minimized, or reinterpreted as voluntary devotion, while monuments, inscriptions, and official histories celebrated obedience as sacred. Yet fragments survive precisely because humans, despite fear and repression, left traces of resistance. Letters, marginal notes, and carefully hidden inscriptions testify to the complexity of lived experience. They reveal fear, endurance, and the persistence of memory, even under extreme control. Historians reading these traces confront the duality of civilization, the grandeur of achievement alongside the quiet endurance of exploitation. As we reflect on these realities, a deeper question emerges. How often do institutions, whether religious, political, or social, claim authority while silencing those who suffer under them? And how many monuments, laws, and doctrines owe their permanence not to justice or virtue, but to the carefully maintained invisibility of human cost? The legacy of the Egyptian temples reminds us that power, faith, and devotion can coexist with cruelty, and that the silence of history is itself a record, demanding not only study, but moral consideration.